Yo, no, seriously, stop. Because if you thought the Kenya Marc Daly divorce story was already messy, buckle up. This isn't just another they grew apart Hollywood breakup. This is the moment the quiet warnings turn into loud alarms. And guess who just stepped into the spotlight? Kenya Moore's mom, yes, that voice people ignored for years now, saying what fans were never ready to hear. Kenya was blind to it. Blind to what, exactly? The distance? The control? The way Marc Daly stayed mysteriously silent while Kenya carried the public weight of the marriage? Or the way every red flag was brushed off as haters being dramatic? Funny how those same haters now sound like prophets. Old clips are resurfacing. Awkward interviews are being replayed. Side dies that once looked petty now look intentional. And Marc? Still quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes people ask uncomfortable questions. So here's the real question: was this marriage doomed from day one? And did Kenya's inner circle see it coming long before the cameras did? Or is this just another case of hindsight pretending it knew the truth all along? Stay right here, because once you see this timeline, you can't unsee it. Everybody thinks they know how the story starts, but that's the trick. It didn't start with a divorce filing, it didn't start with a separation announcement, and it definitely didn't start with Kenya Moore crying in a confessional. It started years earlier, quietly, awkwardly, in moments most people laughed off or skipped past. Back when Kenya would smile through interviews while answering questions that clearly hit a nerve. Back when Marc Daly stood just slightly out of frame, emotionally, and sometimes literally, like a man allergic to the spotlight, but perfectly comfortable benefiting from the glow. At the time, fans called it privacy. Kenya's inner circle called it something else entirely. The people closest to Kenya were saying the same thing over and over, long before the marriage collapsed. They said she was shrinking herself. They said she was overcompensating. They said she was explaining away behavior that didn't need explaining if it was healthy. And every time those warnings surfaced, they were swatted down by viewers who insisted that love just looks different behind closed doors. But now, those closed doors are wide open, and the footage hitting social media feels less like entertainment and more like evidence of a slow emotional erosion. Marc Daly's role in Kenya's world was always framed as the calm counterbalance to her big personality. The grounded businessman, the man who didn't need cameras. The problem is that balance only works when both people are standing on equal ground. What people are noticing now is how often Kenya carried the emotional labor of the relationship alone, defending his absence, justifying his silence, softening his sharp edges for public consumption. There were moments when her voice cracked while his remained steady. Moments when she laughed things off that didn't sound funny at all. Moments when the energy felt off, but nobody wanted to say it out loud. And then there's the fame factor. Kenya Moore didn't just bring love into that marriage, she brought a platform, visibility, access, and relevance. The resurfaced conversations aren't accusing Marc of chasing clout outright, but they're questioning the imbalance. How often did his business ventures benefit from association without reciprocal emotional investment? How often was Kenya expected to show up fully while Marc maintained distance under the banner of being private? Privacy can be healthy, but distance disguised as boundaries tends to leave scars. What's making this hit harder now is the silence. Marc Daly has chosen not to engage publicly as these discussions heat up, and silence has a way of speaking louder than statements ever could. The lack of rebuttal, the absence of clarification, the refusal to address long-standing concerns has created a vacuum that speculation rushes to fill. In that vacuum, people are rewatching clips with fresh eyes, hearing Kenya's words differently, noticing pauses they missed before. That strained smile doesn't look so confident anymore. That defensive tone doesn't sound playful. It sounds tired. Kenya's mom being pulled into the conversation again is what truly shifted the narrative. For years, her concerns were framed as hostility, bitterness, or interference. Viewers were encouraged to see her as unsupportive, cold, even cruel. But time has a way of rearranging villains and truth tellers. When someone warns you early and the ending proves them right, people start wondering whether they misjudged the messenger. The phrase "Kenya was blind to it" isn't being read as an insult anymore. It's being read as a reflection of how deeply she wanted the marriage to work. The idea that this relationship was brewing toward collapse reframes everything. It suggests there was no single betrayal, no explosive incident, no dramatic turning point. Instead, it was years of unmet expectations, quiet resentment, emotional distance, and power struggles that never found resolution. Control doesn't always show up as shouting or rules. Sometimes it shows up as withdrawal, as deciding when to engage and when to disappear, as letting one partner feel like they're asking for too much simply by wanting consistency. Fans who once defended Marc as misunderstood are now reevaluating that stance. They're asking why so much responsibility for the marriage's success seemed to fall on Kenya's shoulders. Why she was always the one explaining, apologizing, contextualizing. Why the burden of emotional translation never shifted. When those questions stack up, the picture changes. Suddenly, the warnings don't look like sabotage. They look like concern that when ignored. This is where the story stops being about a celebrity divorce and starts becoming something more uncomfortable. It becomes a mirror. People see their own relationships in those old clips. The justifications, the rationalizations, the hope that patience will eventually be rewarded. Kenya Moore's public unraveling didn't happen overnight. It happened in slow motion, and now that the footage is replaying in reverse, every step looks clearer. As part 1 closes, the uncomfortable truth begins to settle in. Maybe this wasn't a case of two people growing apart naturally. Maybe it was one person growing while the other stayed distant, protected, and unchanged. Maybe the silence wasn't accidental. And maybe the people who spoke up early weren't trying to interfere at all. They were trying to warn her before the quiet collapse became unavoidable, before the cameras stopped rolling, and before the story could no longer be controlled, because once people started pulling at that thread, the entire fabric of the marriage narrative began to unravel. What once looked like a private, misunderstood relationship now started resembling a carefully managed imbalance. Fans digging through old footage noticed patterns they had never clocked before. Marc controlling when he appeared. Marc deciding which parts of their life were off limits. Marc opting out while Kenya kept opting in. It wasn't loud. It wasn't explosive. It was subtle. And subtle control is always the hardest to explain until it's too late. Anonymous sources suddenly started popping up in comment sections and gossip circles, claiming they'd seen this dynamic up close. People who said they worked around the couple. People who said they'd been in rooms where Kenya was visibly anxious before events while Marc remained detached, almost irritated by the expectation to show emotional unity. None of these voices were verifiable, and yet they all echoed the same theme. Kenya bending, Marc withholding, Kenya justifying, Marc remaining unmoved. Then came the whispers about lifestyle and power. Kenya Moore is a brand, a long-established reality TV fixture with endorsements, visibility, and influence. Marc Daly entered that world as an outsider and, according to these narratives, learned how to benefit without fully participating. He was present when it suited him and absent when it didn't. Business meetings overlapped conveniently with filming schedules. Personal boundaries appeared selectively enforced. Fans began questioning whether privacy was just another word for control over access. Public reactions shifted fast once this framing took hold. The same viewers who once criticized Kenya for being too much started asking why she was always the one compromising, why her needs were treated as negotiable while his were respected as non-negotiable. Old reunion moments resurfaced where Kenya's voice trembled as she defended her marriage against castmates who seemed unconvinced. At the time, it looked like loyalty. Now, it looks like a woman trying to protect something already slipping through her fingers. And then, there was the money talk. Not allegations, not accusations, but questions. Why certain ventures appeared to gain momentum during the height of Kenya's visibility. Why Marc's name stayed mostly out of public criticism while Kenya absorbed the backlash. Why she took the heat for issues fans now believe weren't hers to carry. The narrative quietly shifted from Kenya chose wrong to Kenya was carrying weight that wasn't hers. The internet did what it always does next. It exaggerated. It dramatized. It turned speculation into theories. Threads popped up dissecting body language, tone shifts, and moments of silence. A single clip of Marc refusing to film suddenly became a symbol of emotional withdrawal. A scene where Kenya laughs nervously became evidence of discomfort. Was it fair? Maybe not. But perception doesn't wait for fairness. Once public opinion tilts, it rarely tilts back. Kenya's mom being reintroduced into this phase of the conversation only poured gasoline on the fire. People went back to those painful scenes, the coldness, the distance, the blunt warnings. They reinterpreted them through this new lens. What once looked like cruelty now looked like frustration. What once looked like sabotage now looked like a parent sensing danger and being powerless to stop it. The idea that Kenya was blind to it stopped sounding judgmental and started sounding tragic. Marc's continued silence became its own storyline. In celebrity culture, silence can be strategic, but it can also feel dismissive. Every day without a response allowed speculation to grow unchecked. Kenya, on the other hand, didn't need to say much. Her old interviews were doing the talking for her. The visible strain, the defensive posture, the careful wording, it all lined up too neatly for people to ignore. What made this phase especially explosive was how relatable it felt. Comment sections filled with viewers sharing their own stories. Relationships where one person did all the emotional work. Marriages where distance was labeled as independence. Situations where warnings were dismissed until reality hit hard. Kenya Moore stopped being just a reality star in this narrative. She became a symbol of what happens when love convinces you to overlook patterns you would advise anyone else to run from. This wasn't about proving Marc Daly to be a villain. It was about questioning a system where emotional absence is excused, where silence is framed as strength, and where one partner's needs are constantly deprioritized in the name of keeping peace. The scandal wasn't one action. It was accumulation. 1,000 small moments that never exploded but slowly suffocated the relationship. As this video reaches its breaking point, the tension thickens. Because if all of this was visible in hindsight, if the signs were there all along, then the real fallout was never going to be loud. It was always going to be quiet, controlled, and devastating in the slowest way possible. And the question looming now isn't just what went wrong, but what happens when the narrative finally catches up to the truth people weren't ready to hear. Because once a narrative shifts this hard, there's no such thing as going back to neutral. The conversation stops being about whether the marriage failed and starts becoming about accountability, perception, and consequence. Fans aren't just rewatching clips anymore, they're reinterpreting entire seasons. Moments once edited as awkward now feel loaded. Scenes once brushed off as off-camera issues now feel like deliberate omissions. The question quietly creeping in is whether the truth was always there. Just inconvenient for the storyline everyone wanted to sell, speculation has now moved into the realm of what happens next, and that's where things get messy. People are talking about legal strategies, custody tensions, financial disentanglement, and reputational damage, even though no official statements confirm any of it. Blogs throw around phrases like behind-the-scenes negotiations and private settlements, while anonymous accounts claim insiders are preparing for long-term consequences that won't play out on camera. None of it is proven, but all of it feeds the growing sense that this divorce is less about heartbreak and more about disentangling years of imbalance. Public backlash, once subtle, has become louder. Marc Daly's silence, once defended as dignity, is now framed as avoidance. Kenya's restraint, once criticized as dramatic, is now praised as controlled and strategic. That flip didn't happen by accident. It happened because viewers finally noticed who consistently showed up emotionally and who consistently opted out. In the court of public opinion, participation matters. Absence gets rebranded as indifference very quickly. There's also growing chatter about how this impacts future opportunities. Reality TV thrives on narrative redemption arcs, and Kenya Moore suddenly fits that mold perfectly. The woman who was painted as difficult, defensive, or unlucky in love is now being reframed as someone who ignored red flags because she wanted stability so badly. Meanwhile, Marc's carefully maintained distance now risks being interpreted as calculated rather than cautious. Perception doesn't care about intent. It only cares about patterns. Some commentators have gone as far as to suggest that this could trigger deeper scrutiny into how relationships are portrayed versus how they actually function behind the scenes. The idea that privacy can be weaponized, that emotional withdrawal can hide in plain sight, is resonating with audiences far beyond this one couple. Kenya and Marc's marriage has become a cautionary tale without either of them officially agreeing to that role. What makes this especially complicated is the absence of a dramatic villain moment. There's no explosive scandal to point to, no single betrayal to condemn. That forces people to sit with a much more uncomfortable truth. Sometimes relationships fail because one person slowly disappears while the other keeps reaching. And when that happens publicly, the collapse doesn't look messy enough to justify the pain, which only deepens it. Kenya's mom remains the quiet but powerful thread tying this entire conversation together. Her early warnings now feel less like interference and more like foresight born from experience. That doesn't erase the hurt those moments caused, but it reframes them. It suggests that sometimes the harshest voices are reacting to things they can't fully articulate yet. The line "Kenya was blind to it" lands differently now. Not as blame, but as grief for what could have been avoided. As hypothetical consequences are discussed, people wonder whether Marc will eventually speak, whether silence can hold forever under growing pressure. A statement could reset the narrative, or it could inflame it further. Either way, the longer the quiet stretches, the more it feels like a decision rather than a coincidence. Kenya, by contrast, doesn't need to say anything new. Her past words are being replayed in a new context, and context changes everything. The final realization settling over this story is that the collapse was never loud enough to warn anyone except those paying close attention. That's what makes it resonate. The marriage didn't implode, it eroded. And erosion is easy to miss until the structure can no longer hold its weight. Kenya Moore's journey through this relationship now reads less like a scandal and more like a slow lesson the public wasn't ready to understand until it was already over. As this narrative closes, what lingers isn't outrage but unease. The sense that this wasn't about villains and victims, but about power dynamics that hide behind respectability and silence. The conversation will eventually move on, as it always does, but the questions raised here won't disappear so easily. Because once people recognize emotional absence for what it is, they start seeing it everywhere. And that may be the most uncomfortable consequence of all. So, what does all of this really tell us? Is this just another celebrity divorce, or is it a deeper lesson in emotional awareness, boundaries, and the silent costs of imbalance? Kenya Moore's experience isn't just a headline, it's a mirror for anyone who's ever ignored warning signs because they wanted love to work. And Marc Daly's silence, deliberate or not, reminds us how absence can speak louder than words. Now it's your turn. What do you think? Was Kenya truly blind to the signs? Or were they impossible to see until the marriage reached its tipping point? Was Marc's distance a harmless personality trait, or something far more calculated? Could this entire situation have been avoided if someone had spoken up sooner, or was it destined to quietly collapse no matter what? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear your take, the theories you've pieced together from clips, interviews, and your own observations. Smash that like button if you're shocked by the revelations, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the stories everyone's whispering about but few are willing to dissect. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next episode of Truth and Drama, because when it comes to Hollywood secrets, The story is always bigger than what you see on screen. Stay tuned. Stay curious, and remember, sometimes the quietest collapses make the loudest impact.